Well, welcome everyone to our July session of the Neglected Books Publisher Spotlight, in which we're taking a special look at a press called Sublunary and their special series called the Empyrean series, which is one of the more striking reissue series that I'm aware of in terms of the diversity and the nature of the works they're bringing back. They're not sticking to a particular genre or time frame, and I think that's for me that's really stimulating. So with us today we have Josh Rothes, who's the publisher of Sublunary, and also Jacob Siefring, who is the editor of the Empyrean series. And we're going to be talking about this book, Biographical Recreations from the Cranium of a Giantess, which certainly is the prize winner for the longest and the most unusual title, but also probably the most unusual book we're going to be discussing this year. And so I'm going to start with a little talk about Johann Richter and his work, because I honestly have to admit, I consider myself a relatively literate person. I have a degree in English. I've tried to study world literature, and I was essentially unaware of Jean-Paul as a writer, and appreciate the fact that they've brought this really, I know as a mathematician, you can't say really unique, but he's a really unique writer. And so for a moment, I just want to run through some slides, and then we'll talk a little bit about Sublunary and the series in general, and then dive into who Johann Richter is and this book in particular. And if it's okay with you guys, I have a couple of quotes that I'd like to read about Jean-Paul when we get into talking about him as a writer and his career. So just to start, so we're looking at Sublunary in this particular book this month. Sublunary started, is it 3 years ago now, Josh?
Gosh, 4, early 2019.
Okay, wow. And we have to say, hands down, probably one of the best looking publisher websites on the internet, in my opinion. It's just a real pleasure to navigate. And the diversity of the books at Sublunary. So this is for what is, as far as I can see to the naked eye, a pretty small operation in terms of staff. They've got phenomenal coverage. So this is just a sampling of the books they've brought out under the primary imprint of Sublunary. Nothing fits into a particular time frame. So we have works from the past like Bruno Schultz and Fernando Pessoa. We have current writers like Christina Tudor-Sideri. We have interesting things that may have been available, but were quite obscure and difficult to obtain, like Heinrich von Kleist, who I have to say, if you've never read von Kleist, to me, he is one of the great reads of what you might call classical literature. His novellas, particularly, and I'm hitting a blank here right now.
Michael Kohlhaas.
Michael Kohlhaas, yes, which has been made into it's been filmed a number of times, including as a Western. It's amazing to read a book written in that time frame, and it's absolutely as gripping as an airport bestseller thriller. Really and remarkable. And I think one of the things that I see is you've got a number of works here of interesting that sit sort of not in a convenient genre of criticism, memoir, nonfiction, history, scientific writing. It's all over the place, which is certainly a hot area right now, and frankly, any exploration is to our benefit, I think. And on top of that, they're also publishing a magazine, a literary magazine, which is, one of the most irresponsible acts that can be performed in any world. 100 years ago, it was like, the survival rate is very low, but literature benefits from every one of these things because they provide platforms to bring out new voices and bring out new forms. And I highly recommend looking through that. And one of the nice things is they make some of the content available online. So this isn't just trapped away behind a subscription. So here was a terrific story from the Soviet writer Boris Pilniak, who is another one of these guys that, frankly, you pick up any of his books and it's going to be absolutely gripping from my experience. And so I wanted to take a moment here. And then finally, we have the Empyrean series. And I want to take a break here. So you can see here, it's dedicated to the sort of thing which is my passion, which is the out of print, hard to come by works, because I'm a big believer in just the fact that, here I am, and I'd never seriously known about the works of Jean-Paul Richter, is evidence that we benefit, literary history benefits, by going back into the dusty corners and bringing out these works. For me, a lot of it is about saying the stuff that's in print, the stuff that's in the canon, so to speak, the well-known stuff, it's really such a limit. To me, I like to compare it to the difference between a freeway and the side roads, which is the freeway is the most efficient way to get around, but it doesn't represent the entire landscape. And it's only when you take the time to go around the side roads, you discover just how much is going on in the freeway. In fact, you don't see the best parts of the country, any country, when you're on the auto route or the expressway or the freeway. It's when you get off the road and you explore the corners that you start to realize, my gosh, there is so much out there. And that's certainly true in the case of literary history. So I want to take a moment to ask Josh to kind of talk about the genesis of Sublunary and kind of where you're taking this press, and then Jacob can chime in and talk about the Empyrean series in general.
Sure, that sounds good. And thanks for the intro, Brad. So I started Sublunary Editions actually as a monthly newsletter. It was we started with a $5 a month subscription, and I would commission new pieces of writing every month that we would do small broadsides of, put them in envelopes and send them out around the world. I'll end with Jacob, so I'll actually start with the first. I'll start and end with Jacob. So when we were in the middle of planning out kind of the early months of the monthly mail outs, and Jacob had said something on Twitter about a long short story by Pierre Sange, who Jacob is the most prolific English translator of the French writer Pierre Sange. We've done 3 books with him. And, I said, hey, he said, I had this thing, it got accepted, and the magazine kind of ghosted it. And I reached out, had never talked to Jacob before. It was just like, hey, that sucks, but I've got space, maybe, if it makes sense. And then he sent me the story, and it was really good. And it was unfortunately too long for the monthly mailing series. We had sort of page count limit because everything had to be able to take a standard stamp. Otherwise, it was not feasible to do it. And I said, why don't we do a chapbook? And that was the first of, I think we are over 80 publications at this point, between the Empyrean series, Firmament, and the main Sublunary line. And really, that is kind of it in a nutshell. Like, when I think of like what unifies the output, not just Sublunary or Empyrean, but both, it's this kind of like, let me just tug on a thread and see what comes out. And it was, beginning to ask people what they had that they were working on, writers that I admired. I reached out to Jessica Siefring, who is the editor of Firmament now, but at the time was just a writer I admired, and that led to some of our my early book with her, and then a translation down the line. And so a lot of it is just finding those weird obsessives. No offense, Jacob, but people who are in it to also pull these threads. And a big theme of the books we work on is intertextuality. It's works that are part of what I feel is an ongoing conversation, and maybe not, to piggyback on Brad's metaphor, maybe not the central conversation of the party, but the little side conversations happening, and someone leaves that and goes to another one. And this leads to works that I think are there is a choral effect, I hope, in the output. And you can see, I think, if you really trace the lineage of sublunary titles, you start to see a through line. Like early in 2021, we published a new translation of Rainer Maria Rilke's The Voices in Other Poems, and that was done by Chris Menta. We published Chris Menta's debut book of poetry earlier this year. On the back of that volume, we used a couple of blurbs, really just quotes from writers who admired Rilke. I think one on the website is from Bruno Schulz, and we, in fact, published a Bruno Schulz short story, which was lost and recently rediscovered in early 2020. On the back of the Schulz book, we use a quote from Isaac Bashevis Singer. Last year, we published previously unpublished story of singers. And within Empyrean, you have books like Jacob brought the works of Emmanuel Carnevale. These just came in, Jacob, to my attention, which then spawned several other books that came out of researching him. I think the Schulz story was probably the first sort of exciting hit. Like our first 6 books, I think, were all living writers. Pierre Songe, Kyle Coma Thompson, Tristan Foster, Christina Tudor-Sideri, Monica Bellevin, and Jessica's book, first book with us. And then Frank Garrett sent me an interesting message that said, hey, someone found a Bruno Schulz story that came out, 12 years before he started publishing. If you want to do it, I could translate it in a few months. And I think, as such a fan of world literature, and I guess I actually hate that. I'm not a fan of world literature. I'm a fan of literature, and translation and is a way to get to more of the stuff that I like. It is my publishing project is almost like, as much as I talk about it, and almost like it's missionary work. It's really like I want to have these books and have them exist and be able to read them and be able to share them with others and talk about them in a way that one can't if they are locked away in archives or completely untranslated. So that sort of like clued me in that there's a lot of stuff out there, even from the well-known writers that is either been languishing in sort of copyright purgatory or has never been translated. If you actually look, there are very, very few writers, if any, I might say, who are completely translated. Even some of the ones you might be surprised by, like we still don't have all of Borges in English, astoundingly. So that's sort of these like kind of 2 threads of sublunary. You have works that have never been translated. You saw Horacio Quiroga's last book of short stories, Beyond El Más Allá. And then Kleist Anecdotes, which have been some of the longer stories, have been translated, but the entire volume has never been translated until we did our edition of it. And in doing the same kind of research around that, I started thinking like, oh, there's also a lot of early 20th century translations and modernist writers. I'm a big fan of sort of various strains of American and European modernism that are out of print. And I started thinking about it in terms of, you go on Amazon, I know I do it too sometimes, and you find these facsimile copies of like public domain books, and it's like, okay, that may be a useful reference, but I bet if someone actually came and like did nice retypeset versions of these, that they would probably sell better than the crappy looking ones with the generic covers. And I started thinking like, maybe this is something we could get into, but I knew I was going to need some help with it. Around the same time, Jacob, who we had done 2 books together at this point, with him as translator of Pierre Sange, and he said, he came out of nowhere and said, hey, I got a weird idea, a book you might want to look into, that I would be interested in editing a volume of. It's called A Looking Glass for the Court by a Spanish bishop of the, Jacob, is it 17th century or 16th century?
He died in 1545.
There we go, 16th century Spanish bishop. And it has been out of print since then, and the preface has never been translated. And I was like, you're my guy. So that is a serendipitous, and my publishing history is replete with serendipitous moments. But we have been working on this ever since, and we've just published our 35th volume. 34 and 35 were reissues of 2 books by Eugene Jolas, the editor of Transition magazine, serializer of Finnegan's Wake, translator of Kafka, et cetera, et cetera. Also Berlin Alexander Platz, not to let Kafka overshadow everyone. And I'll let Jacob kind of pick it up here, but much like the grander story, it's been a lot of thread pulling. It's been a lot of reading guys who have done their reading, a lot of I won't give away all our sources, Jacob, but finding kind of finding our sources and finding our guys, and then sort of spreading out from there. But we did, in our very first 5, long story novella. It was actually, I think, an appendage to another work called Maria Vutz by Jean-Paul, and that was my introduction to Jean-Paul. Jacob, how did you discover that?
That can't have been your introduction to Jean-Paul, because the first book in the series was 3 Dreams. Which has 2 dreams by Jean-Paul, and sandwiched in the middle of them is a dream from, which may or may not be, from the pen of Lawrence Stern. It was only edited posthumously, and we're not 100% sure that he did write it, but at least one editor has attributed that dream to him. I'm not sure exactly when I came to Jean-Paul, but it must have been at least 4 years ago, I think, that I tried to read Jean-Paul. And if you look at Jean-Paul's reception and reputation in English, a lot of people might know that Thomas Carlyle translated 2 works by Jean-Paul in the 1820s when he was translating various German authors. And it was reprinted in a facsimile edition in the 1990s by Camden House. I think they're in Boston, but and they've since been incorporated into Boydell and Brewer. In any case, the 2 works that Carlyle translated are called Army Chaplain Schmelzel's Journey and Life of Quintus Fixline. I read the first of those, didn't really like it very much at all. And I haven't read all of the second one either. I think Carlyle is problematic as a translator. But it was only when we decided to do the Empyrean series, and we started to, at that time, very early on, we started to build a large spreadsheet of ideas and leads. And you had mentioned wanting to do something with Jean-Paul. And like I said, he'd been in my library in some form or other, but I hadn't really experienced him in the way that maybe I wanted to. So the first thing I started to do was researching what had appeared, what works had been published in English. And there's actually a lot. And you can actually experience a lot of it on Project Gutenberg in pretty good markup. You know, these are not perfect transcriptions. They may not have been proofread carefully, but his longer novels, The Invisible Lodge from 1793, that's one of his earliest works. Also Titan, a very long novel, and another very long novel called Siebenkäse, which means seven cheeses in German. That's the name of the character. Those are all on Project Gutenberg. They were translated in the roughly around the 1880s. And one of the most prolific translators of John Paul was a Unitarian bishop in New England called Charles T. Brooks. His translations are pretty good. But in any case, when I was first looking at John Paul's work, I discovered the Maria Vutz novella, probably at archive.org or something. It was published in by a husband and wife. It was translated by a husband and wife and translated or published in 1881 in London. They broke it up. They broke it up into chapters and introduced like epigraphs, which are not in the original. So we removed those, removed the chapter divisions, located some places where the translator skipped original passages, and we had a translator in England, Ruth Martin, repair the omissions. But at the same time, I was also realizing that one of John Paul's most famous passages is a passage from Siebenkäse, and that is the speech of the dead Christ, who proclaims that there is no God. And that was something of a revelation to discover that piece. Of course, we all, most everyone has heard about Nietzsche and his famous passage in The Gay Science where he proclaims that God is dead. And reading John Paul's version of the dead Christ proclaiming that there is no God, which is a dream sequence, that led me to start to think about whether or not Nietzsche had read that and was aware of it, because it was published about 85 years, or give or take, before Nietzsche made his famous writing. In the end, I couldn't decide whether or not Nietzsche had read that particular passage or not. It circulated in various forms. But
wasn't it possible, I think, that de Nerval might have nicked it from Jean Paul and Nietzsche might have gotten it back from de Nerval? Like, it was out of line of thinking we went down.
Definitely a possibility. And Nerval probably got it from Madame de Staël. But so it circulated in a few different writers' versions. And Gerard de Nerval, his version is a sonnet, I think. In any case, before we talk a little bit more specifically about John Paul and maybe this book, I just want to say that I really do agree with Brad's metaphor that he introduced about there being essentially a kind of highway, and if we stick to the highway, we never see what is off the highway. I'll read a quick quote that I found in a work by Ludwig Tieck, a German author, but it says, scholarship and criticism in a given area beget more scholarship and criticism in the same area, until there's far too much activity in one place and far too little in another. And a corresponding warp is given to our sense of the actual value of certain works, themes, or authors. This is absolutely the case. It's one of the things that sort of makes me, I don't know if angry is the right word, but it's definitely a motivating force, because as much as I've read and appreciate authors like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, 20th century modernists like Faulkner, Shakespeare, these are all authors who are celebrated daily, and even have cottage industries of academic criticism devoted to their work. We're really interested in discovering authors who There may only be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 scholars in the 20th century who really went deep on their work at all. And that's the case with a lot of our authors. Those are the ones we get excited about, and those are the ones that we want to look at their work. In some cases, like John Paul and like Antonio de Guevara, the Spanish bishop we mentioned earlier, they were extremely popular in their time, and they've been since relegated to the dustbin or the archives in a way, because their style is considered either too excessive or unrefined, or for whatever reason, it doesn't meet our current standards of eloquence and taste and what's exciting. But by looking back at what has been dismissed, we are able to get a new outlook on eloquence, on history, literary history and reception, and so forth.
Yeah, I think
so-
something we said
I wanted
early
to-
on, we called it the anti-canon, was a phrase we use just between ourselves. And
Right.
getting into it, one realizes just not just maybe stylistically fashions changing, but just people who maybe lacked that one scholar or that one younger writer who kept their name in the mix later. I mean, it is a bit capricious who is not to cast aspersions on, say, Goethe, but it's could have been Jean Paul. Just
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to chime in with a couple of points to just build on what Jacob was saying. One of the things I found when I went back to grad school and was writing and engaging with academics about forgotten writers and their books is there are a couple of factors that kind of adds to or increases neglect, and also the corollary increases the well-knownness and the strength of people like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, William Faulkner, etc. So a discussion I must have had at least a dozen times with the academics that I talked to throughout England was, oh, who is this person? Oh, no, I've never heard of them. Oh, am I interested in reading? Has anybody else written about them? No. So there's a tendency in academia to be more than happy to be the second or 47th person to write about a particular author or work, partly because it gives you references that you can incorporate and react against, whereas with a completely unknown writer, there is almost a reaction like, well, that's your word, but nobody else is saying, and I'm not sure why we should care about this. The second thing I want to say, so there's this resistance to, and that's one of the reasons in our Recovered Book series where we include sort of what I call academic light afterwards, because now that sort of lays the groundwork that that essay can at least be incorporated as a reference in the second thing that gets written or the third thing. The other is there is a real resistance, despite the fact that academics all like to tout how much time they spend in the archives. The truth is most of them don't like to spend time in the archives. They like it to be something they can get, buy now from Amazon, or it's in the library. And the fact that it's on Project Gutenberg or the Internet Archive, yeah, I mean, you can find a wealth of texts from the 19th century when there was a proliferation of English translations of foreign literature, from Spain, from France, from Germany, from Russia. I mean, most people don't know how many different versions of Tolstoy were available to English language readers, probably as many or more then in, say, 1880 as there are now, in terms of being in print. Not all of them were very good. You can find all those translations, or many of them, on the Internet Archives. They're scanned, they're kind of ugly, they're not the most pleasant reading experience unless you're very comfortable with spending hours tabbing through pages on a PDF, in a PDF on a tablet. Most people, even academics, won't go to that effort. So when you take a book like this and make it available, and it's a nice edition, and it's available for sale right now, it's in print, you've dramatically increased the likelihood that it will be reincorporated into the dialogue that is literary history. So I think, the recognition that the act of bringing these things back to print is really a fundamentally important act. We can see them in the classic that we all refer to often is the Virago Modern Classics series, which frankly, before that series came out, almost no one was writing about those women authors. And it revealed what a remarkable oeuvre existed in terms of writing by English women, say between the 20s and the 50s, mostly the 20s and 30s and 40s. And that was all by making the books available on print, in an attractive format. As Jacob said, virtually every text on the Internet Archive is available from some print-on-demand hack source, and it's essentially as ugly a presentation as reading the darn thing on screen, except it's more expensive. So going through the effort of correcting the text, because as Jacob says, many times it turns out that stuff got missed, stuff got dropped, stuff got changed, stuff got added. And so coming back to a reliable text that can be made available, that it's a reliable version of it, it has such a fundamentally important function in terms of enriching our understanding of literary history. I want to take a moment just to jump now into the series in particular. I'm going to go back to the slide and talk about and the book a little bit, just introducing. So Biographical Recreations, which is I have to say, I was really struck by how modernistic this text is. This reminds us, the comparison with Lawrence Sterne is a natural one, because Sterne in Tristram Shandy experiments on almost every page in a way that we didn't see writers doing in English until James Joyce, really, where he essentially made it okay to play around with the text and go off of a straight narrative track. So Jean-Paul was essentially, I guess, the pen name of Johann Richter. And I just want to bring a couple of quotes in. This is from a 2006 book about Jean-Paul. And just to add that what was said, so this is early on in this book, it says the roll call of authors who line up to pay their debt to him is as long as it is impressive. E.T.A. Hoffmann enlisted Jean-Paul to write the preface to his first collection of stories. Hegel helped him procure an honorary doctorate, and briefly they considered writing what might have been one of the great works of philosophy, except for this following phrase, a philosophical primer for women written by two men, so maybe let's put an asterisk on the might have been greatest. Gottfried Keller swore his eternal allegiance to him. Adalbert Stifter wrote an early novel called Condor under the heavy dose of Jean-Paul. Alfred Kubin likewise did, though, with a fascinating novel from the early 19th century or 20th century called The Other Side. Even made illustrations for reprints of Jean-Paul's works. Robert Walser found an introduction to the ways of the small and strange, and Walser is certainly a genius of the small and strange. Alfred Doblin lamented the enduring abandonment of such a genius. Hermann Hesse declared that a mass of books becomes dispensable after one has read them, partly because he is such a heavily intertextual writer. The poet Oscar Lirke entitled a essay called Jean-Paul, the Most Unknown Genius. Paul Celan was interested in him and actually kind of had a collection of poems inspired by Jean-Paul. Thomas Bernhard talks to him in his novel Extinction, where he calls Siebenkäs, the Seven Cheese novel, among the 5, quote, ineluctable works of German prose, the one novel prior to the 20th century. That's for German authors, at least, he is not an obscure figure of the past, but, here in English, essentially he fell off the face of the literary map after the late 19th century. He is certainly, this title is not the cleverest, the longest, or most intricate of his titles. So just a few of them. The Army Chaplain Schmelz's Journey to Fletz. And the Siebenkäs title is actually called Fruit and Thorn Pieces, or the Married Life, Death, and Wedding of the Advocate of the Four, or Firmian Stanislaus Siebenkäs in the Reichsmarktflechten Kunstnovel. And then going through it, I looked through this novel online, and I love the little synopses that you get in 19th century novels of what the contents are going to be. Potato war with women and with men, which, having read that chapter, there really isn't much about a potato war between women and men, but it sure got me reading it. And he is being talked about. And one of the fascinating things I came across was one of the more remarkable titles of Anaka, but this actually was published in an article and then incorporated in Adrian Daub's recent book from the University of Chicago Press, where he has a chapter called About Siebenkäs, where he's titled The Transcendental Masturbators. So that will raise your eyebrows in a heartbeat. So Biographical Recreations originally appeared in German 1796, came out around 1840 something. There was both in Scotland, I think, in 41, and then in the US in 1842 in Monthly Magazine. And this is one of those things where this is an effect. I mean, this is a substantial work, and here it is in this tiny 2-column print that appeared in 19th century magazines. I mean, these magazines like Monthly, Bentley's Miscellany, they're fabulous sources of text, because they would publish a scientific article, then they'd have a piece of original fiction, then they'd have some nonfiction, then they'd have a travel piece, and then maybe a play in it. And from a reading experience, it's horrible because it's in this tiny print in 2 columns. But those are the sorts of gems that are still waiting to be extracted. If we can take them out, clean up the text, and put them in a nice reading experience, I think tons of people would be interested in it. This was not considered one of his major things at the time. So this was something that was written about him in fact, you can see it was a translation by the Reverend Brooks that Jacob referred to, where he says it's an incomplete and a drop of commenced narrative under a mass of satire. And even about the same time, this was an interesting collection that Julian Hawthorne, who was Hawthorne's son, contributed to, where he refers to them as written in the bitterness of an empty purse, odd titles truly, and odder style. And from a more recent study from Dorothy Berger, I wanted to read this quote because I think if you've read the book, you would have to agree with this, but which is both the shortcoming and richness of this text. There's absolutely no continuity in the narration of the story. The reader must be ready to reread a sentence more than once. He must concentrate on each word, grapple with metaphors, comparisons, allegories, and allusions. He must be willing to acquaint himself with names and facts belonging to all fields of knowledge. He will need dictionaries and encyclopedias. He must study the footnotes provided by the author and by subsequent editors. It is useless to ask why John Paul did not write in a simpler way. Apparently, he could not express in an easy manner what he had to say. And since ignorance of the law does not protect a criminal against justice, why should the law of ignorance of the reader prevent John Paul from having a style of its own? Which is a lovely way to put it, I think. I love it. To use an analogy, one of my favorite stories for modern music is the composer Charles Ives was in the audience in the premiere of a work by another composer named Charles Ruggles, which was very dissonant as it was, as people were pushing the envelopes. It was very dissonant. And as the piece was being played, there was a man sitting in front of him who was just grumbling about, this is just noise. This makes so sense. It's the worst music I've ever heard. And Ives tapped the man on the shoulder and he said, sit up and use your ears like a man. And, this is asking us to use our eyes and our mind, not to be sexist like a man, but essentially challenging us to step up to a challenging text. So with that, I think that's all I've got here. And just open it up. So to Jacob to introduce the text as you'd like to, and then we'll open up for a discussion among the folks who have had a chance to read it or are still considering reading it. And just before we start, I do want to mention there is, if you receive the discount code by signing up, please take advantage of it because you'll get this wonderful little additional bonus, the 2 stories by John Paul, which is always also, as actually in some ways, it's even more fun. Yes, exactly. 2 stories. How
Thanks,
often
Brett.
do you get offers like that from a publisher?
Well, hopefully not very often. We don't have too many competitors in the field of John Paul studies yet, but it could happen. We
They're
thought,
coming.
if we start a movement, other people might poach our territory. We don't own John Paul, but he's out of copyright anyways. By way of introduction, one thing I'll say about this work, which I did find in that periodical that you showed, the Monthly Chronicle, was published in London. It was edited by the famous novelist of It Was a Stormy Night fame. Edward Bulwer Lytton was the editor. In any case, I found it in the periodical form, and that was how I became interested in the work, realized that the translation was incomplete, and commissioned a translation of the remainder of the book by Janice Grill, who's made her career translating Robert Musil, among other writing that she has done herself. But the thing I wanted to say is that John Paul is usually classified as a romantic, a figure of the Romantic period in German literature. But he's also a product of the Enlightenment. He was born in, if I recall, 1763. And so he's growing up, he turned about 30 by the time the French Revolution arrived, roughly. But he is a product of the Enlightenment. And his work is encyclopedic in a certain sense. I want to clarify, because when people say that an author writes encyclopedically or their work is encyclopedic, they sometimes mean different things. Sometimes they mean that the books are very long, which is the case with John Paul in most instances, that most of the books he's better known for are very long. But he's encyclopedic in the sense that he's reading a lot of encyclopedias and he's inserting encyclopedic knowledge into the books. He's absolutely delighted by the oddities that you can find in an encyclopedia. And I think that comes through, and it comes across in almost all of his work because it's so intertextual. He's citing figures who are not just German authors. He's citing the English authors like Stern, and all kinds of scientific facts from the scientific revolution, which is occurring in the 18th century. As for the narrative in this book, I think one of the quotes you read, Brad, said that it would be useless to try to summarize it or to even try to pull out a single narrative. But this book is divided into 3 parts mainly. There's the main narrative, Biographical Recreations from the Cranium of a Giantess, which is, it foregrounds the narration as the author tells us that he's traveling about the countryside in a carriage. And then by about the 3rd chapter out of these 6 chapters, he finally gets around to telling a story, which is about, it's a love story set in the time of the French Revolution with countless digressions. And it would be fairly hard to summarize this. It involves some melodramatic scenes of a deathbed scene, if I recall, and romantic love scenes as well that incorporate the romantic culture of landscape appreciation that you find in German literature at this time. The other 2 big parts of this book are the 2 appendixes. And John Paul's work is characterized by this tendency to insert appendixes and prefaces wherever he could. And he would insert a preface at the end of the book or in the middle of the book. Why not? The first appendix is a satirical appendix titled Preface to the Satirical Appendix, or Extract from the Record of the Proceedings of the Summary Case on behalf of the reader, plaintiff, contra John Paul accused, concerning the satires, treatises, and digressions of the aforenamed. And so this is essentially a courtroom transcript of the judicial proceedings against John Paul, in which he's kind of play acting, and the reader is charging him with being too licentious or libertine with his digressions, and again those too freewheeling. In any case, it's very funny. The second appendix is essentially a novella, which doesn't really have any bearing to the other parts of this work, but that's fairly common in John Paul's work. In fact, the novella Maria Vats, which we talked about before, and which was one of the first publications in the series, was an appendix to the novel The Invisible Lodge. So it's fairly common for him to be, he's a graphomaniac. He can't stop writing. He can't stop telling stories. And how is he going to get them all out there? He writes very long novels, and he appends the additional novellas as appendices or digressions inside the long novels. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think he does declare, and I right in up front, he says in this, upon nothing in books is the public so hot as upon that which most disgusts it on the stage. I mean, narration. You know, and of course, you know, in a theater form, no one wants to see someone standing to the side essentially telling us the action that's going on. I mean, I found it a fascinating observation I'd never really considered, but when you go to a theater, you don't expect, actually, Thornton Wilder's Our Town is one of the few examples where you have the stage manager essentially as the narrator telling you what's going on. That's so actually unusual in theater. But of course, we expect that, and particularly, you know, the novels of the 16th or the 17th, 18th, 19th century were still, there was usually some authorial voice telling you what was going on, which a lot of modern readers find sort of intrusive. And in this case, he's sort of like, he says, well, that's a crutch, and in fact, he never does get off the stage because his commentary is almost more of the story than the story itself.
It always amuses me when people treat metafiction like it's this thing that was invented in the 1940s in American literature, because it's like one of the oldest modes of writing. John Paul is like, one of the critics who mentioned, who said something about his early works being the product of a light purse and an empty stomach. You get the sense in some ways that he writes like the elements of narrative, of storytelling, not that he doesn't love, like, he's a writer almost, you could say like Calvino, the guy, or even like some of the ways like Kurt Vonnegut would sort of, bring in like story ideas from his fictional alter ego, just so he can kind of get the idea down, but he doesn't have any interest in like making it a full thing. And you get the sense that, these appendices, these prefaces, are often these digressions, these dream sequences are really where Jean Paul is most comfortable. And where, he can get away with doing things. And this is a thing, writers would do all the time. They could do things in dream sequences that they couldn't maybe in the course of a narration, both in terms of what they could get away with stylistically and what they could get away with saying, that might draw the ire of whomever in authority. Because it's a dream. It's, they had, the notion, pre-Freud's notion of the subconscious, that it's, it's your brain, making stuff up. So it's, to be realistic, it has to be, sometimes outlandish and discordant. So that is why, in fact, though, Jean Paul says at one point, not to shamelessly plug another book, that Jacob, you may remember the exact quote, but essentially he said that he would love to have a book of nothing but his prefaces. That really, that was where he felt he was doing his most interesting work, and he wished there was a way to write prefaces without having to write the books. And so we actually do have an entire volume of his prefaces available as well.
Well, I think the Polish writer Stanisław Lem, actually, he did something similar to that. I can't remember which title of his it is, but he has a book where he basically writes about other books, but none of them are books that actually exist. And, it's the sort of thing that, Joyce, Borges, people like that sort of reminded us that playfulness was allowable in literature, but the mistake is to think that it started with them, because and my sense is that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what fascinating things there are available in the literature of particularly the 18th century. In English, I'm familiar with, is that a lot of stuff. It was a time when there was a lot of, there were not major publishers, right? That's one of the things that leads to the richness and diversity of what's available, is that there weren't essentially massive publishers that dominated. There were tons of, printers who decided to make some books on the side, or someone who wrote a book and decided to go get it printed. And didn't know that there were certain paradigms, and didn't know there were genres, and that there were stylistic cliches that we had to conform to. And honestly, that's almost like, if you had to say that, to me, looking across the Empyrean series, the one thing that distinguishes it is there isn't a particular, that they're all texts that escape in some way from a particular neat genre formula. They're kind of this and that.
We like to think that we're independent in what we curate and select, but joked to Josh that we're really not that independent because everything we do is determined by what other people choose to neglect or choose to not publish. So we're reactive in that sense, that we're only interested in doing what people haven't touched. And it, if that's all I'll say about that. I mean, what we've definitely, there's authors that we like that are well looked after by other publishers, that we won't touch because they're already represented.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny when, I mentioned when we started, and part of the inspiration was seeing all the facsimile editions. And initially, we were gonna look, and I think we've done a couple things where we've, just pulled the source text of a book and cleaned it up. And our recent Life of Don Quixote and Sancho by Miguel de Unamuno. I mean, Jacob, I'm sure you did some editorial work on it beyond just making sure we got a clean version of the text, but more frequently than not, like, we are doing the kind of restoration work. Jacob did work. The very first book where we included the dream sequence, he mentioned, was our version ends up being sort of a editorial collation of different versions. I think De Quincey being one of the translators, Jacob, if I'm not mistaken, of that particular dream sequence of the Dead Christ. And even I think it says in the beginning, Jacob, it was what, like only 35% of Biographical Recreations was translated for the monthly magazine. So
That's right.
sold in the remaining 65%. And I don't know that either of us necessarily knew we were going to get into this, full on restoration work. I mean, we've commissioned new translations of things at times. We've done collected works volumes that took, years of effort. And I don't think that was necessarily what I thought this was going to be, but I'm glad it's turned into what it has.
What have been what have been reactions to by readers? I mean, now that these books are available, are you getting feedback from folks who are reading them and have a reaction to them in terms of liking it, hating it, eyes opening to a new writer, a new approach? What's the feedback been so far?
Well, it's hard to keep the books in stock, so that's the first bit of good feedback. We did kind of smaller print runs, expecting like, it may over time, as we build up the backlist. But a lot of, I'm sitting here looking at a whiteboard with all the titles that we need to reprint on it. Right. It's always a pleasant surprise. Jean-Paul, I think, is like, when I've run sales, the number of people who like come in and are like, all right, I'm going to buy all the Jean-Paul now. It's actually been rather incredible. A couple of reviewers have done longer pieces on him. I'd love to see more of that, but I know a couple have been pitching around things. So I think we're definitely raising the critical awareness of some of these writers. The collected projects we've done, you'd always want them to get picked up a little bit more, but I also know that some have been gotten into university libraries and have turned some heads in those fields. Jacob, what's
I want to take a moment just to plug this one, which I think is an amazing project, the collected works of Kathleen Tankersley Young. Definitely someone who fell completely off the map, and pulled together. And I love the way you did this. This is sort of the approach we're taking with our Genevieve Taggart collection, which is, it's not just the poetry, there's some prose in there, there's biographical information. And to me, it enriches the whole experience of the text, because you realize, and she unfortunately lived a very brief life, and so her oeuvre can be contained in a fairly small book. But this is a case where I would hope you're going to see articles talking about her work in the context of other stuff from that time frame. In the next 3 to 5 years, you start to see them coming out and showing scholars engaging with that work that frankly they wouldn't have touched with the 20-foot pole.
Yeah, and there are a couple of scholars working on her. We lucked out a bit. I mean, I guess we just poked around in the right places where we, my co-editor on the volume, Eric Laprade, is in possession of 2 unpublished manuscripts and some other miscellaneous papers of hers. I think he learned about her through Charles Henry Ford, and then when he saw some papers go up for sale, he bought them, and we managed to get in touch with him. And he had, we had her books. She published 3 slim books during her life, and there were pieces in magazines like Transition or Poetry or some of the other bigger of the small magazines. But he had in there an application she had written for, I think, the Yale Young Poets scholarship, fellowship, and it on.
Oh, we lost Josh for a second there.
Ever go if you were just searching through the usual suspects. And certainly one of the most rewarding things I've worked on, especially given her work stopped being published essentially when she died. I think her last aside from a couple of she was published in the mid-century in an anthology of poets of the Harlem Renaissance, and thus she was actually, when I started Googling her, she was listed as an African-American poet, part of the Harlem Renaissance. She was not at all. That's how little people knew of her.
Right.
And her last, I think, new writing that was published was in Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler's novel, The Young and the Evil. And she is essentially a character, or really kind of 2 characters pseudonymously in the novel. And Charles Henry Ford quotes at length her letters to him, like verbatim. But of course, she is, I think, the novel is dedicated to her, but nowhere does he say, like, I'm actually using her letters for this.
Right. That's interesting. Let me just, because we're past the hour, I want to open it up if any of the other folks who've joined us want to offer some questions or some thoughts in reaction to the text. I want to make sure you have an opportunity. So if you do, just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll add you to the conversation. And if not, that's fine. If we don't have any questions, if it's not too much of a diversion, I wanted to touch on something that Jacob mentioned, which was the kind of the rapture about landscape that you see in the John Paul book, but was so common. You see it in so many texts from that period. And that's been, we looked at reissuing a novel by John Masefield called Odta, which stands for One Damn Thing After Another. And the first chapter of that book is simply a description. It's like 25, 30 pages of a description of the landscape of this fictional country, which is one of the reasons why we chose not to publish it, because today's readers, I think most readers today run into these long landscape description passages, and we don't know what to do with them. And do you have any thoughts on why there was a time when those things were so common in literature, and now no writer would spend more than like a paragraph on landscape description today? Why has that kind of dropped off the map, do you think?
Well, the ability to reproduce images that is so powerful in this time of history makes, you know, a long descriptive passage of landscape almost redundant or superfluous. The ability to reproduce images circa 1790, you know, printing had advanced quite a lot, but and then I think there must be an element at which society became stable enough that you could appreciate it. I'm thinking like in the United States, for instance, or in North America, you look at the early literature, nature is not a source of wonder and comfort and fascination because it's dangerous. It can kill you. It's not safe. And it takes a long time until in the United States or North American literature, you start to see that sort of attitude. Now, I don't know enough about German history, but I think that life, you know, was hard enough or utilitarian enough, and that maybe towards the late 18th century, people were comfortable and affluent enough and society was stable enough to permit that sort of reverie and that sort of imaginative appreciation.
That's a good point, because it is very much a hallmark of the Romantic movement, isn't it? I mean, a landscape is such a huge factor in Romantic poetry in particular, and you know, people like William Cullen Bryant in America was all these landscape poems, and so I think it's probably a good point. until there's a certain benign aspect of it, then it's tough to be wax lyrical about it.
Yeah, you have this, you know, you almost have the, you know, age of exploration, which takes a while for people to get comfortable, and then you, not that there weren't naturalists going early, but like this sort of late Enlightenment period is really exciting time in naturalism. I mean, Jean Paul's almost a perfect contemporary with Alexander von Humboldt, who was a, you know, as big a celebrity I think as you could get in Germany at the time, and you know, islands and penguins and small whales and other things named after him. And I think, you know, to that point, there is a period of like, this is of great public interest, because you weren't able to reproduce images of the places these guys were going, and you get what, you know, we would call now like ekphrastic writing almost.
Right. Yeah. It just, I mean, that's a digression, but it's an aspect that kind of fascinates me, that there was a time when readers not only kind of tolerated, but sort of appreciated 15-20 pages of descriptions of landscapes. I think part of it is we may no longer have that capacity to translate on our own imagination the written description to the visual, because we've been so inundated with the visual, for sure. You know, our experience of those things has sort of like been burnt out compared to how intense that sort of experience of reading about the landscape must have been like for people who just didn't encounter that on a regular basis, didn't see it in visual form, in their personal experience, and so it was probably far more exciting than it is to us today. So we've gone over our time, and I appreciate a great discussion, and what a remarkable series. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about where we are for coming up. So just as a reminder, please take advantage of the discount code Generous, and you get a bonus book, which is terrific. Next month, we're going to be going back to British literature. We're going to be talking about one of the books in the British Library Women's series, edited by Simon Thomas. Simon will be joining us and we'll be talking about what he says is one of his favorite books from this series called Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. So with that, let me just stop this and thank Josh and Jacob for joining us, and everyone else who's joined us for this discussion about a fascinating book and a fascinating series. I certainly encourage you to experience and explore what's going on with the Sublunary and the Empyrean series, because it is not sticking to a norm, and we all benefit when people take the risk of going off piste, so to speak, as they say in skiing.
Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see folks next month. Take care.
Bye.